Hello, I'm here today with Professor Terry Maroney to talk about the intersections of law, psychology, and the new coronavirus outbreak. This webinar is the result of a partnership between the University of Brazil Students' Law Review Journal, a review that organizes online seminars for law students. Professor Terry Maroney is a professor of law and of medicine, health, and society at Vanderbilt University in the United States. She was a fellow of Stanford University's Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences. In 2006, she published her first article in the emerging fields of law and emotion and stood out as one of the foremost researchers in the area. Professor Terry Maroney, thank you so much for being with us in this afternoon.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, Professor, the notion that reason and emotion are cleanly separable is deeply ingrained. People do believe that one cannot think and feel at the same time. Your research, however, shows that this idea is not very correct, right? Why is that? And how contemporary scientific research is moving in the direction of concluding that emotion is necessary to rationality?
No, that's really the question that's at the basis of everything, isn't it? Law traditionally holds very tightly to this idea that there's reason and that there's emotion, and law is supposed to be about reason, and therefore we segregate the emotion as much as humanly possible. So it turns out there's two things wrong with that narrative. The first thing that's wrong with the narrative is that reason and emotion, as you've said, are not actually very separable. And the second thing is that the effort of trying to separate them actually does damage to our decision making. So it's very hard to encapsulate several decades of scientific research in a short talk, but the basics of it are that at the brain level, at the experiential level, and at the decision-making level, what we think of as emotions, which are sort of the things that we feel in reaction to certain situations like anger, surprise, sorrow, hatred, fear, whatever it might be, that those emotional aspects of ourselves are intimately tied up with the thinking parts of ourselves. So it's virtually impossible to have a thought without some sort of associated emotion, and it is literally impossible to have an emotion without thoughts. And I can give a very quick example of how that's so. So think about whenever sometime you've been angry at somebody, you can always unpack the thinking narrative that's behind it. So you were angry at somebody for a reason, right? And you would never be angry at an inanimate object, for example, like a rock. And if you did become angry at a rock, you'd immediately think, well, that's silly because rocks don't intend me any harm. So anger is the thought process that somebody who is a moral agent has wrongly chosen to harm you or someone or something you care about without reason. That's the thinking part, right? So it's literally impossible to be angry without a thought process. So again, there's much more I could say about the science here, but the idea is that the two are interlinked. And if you try to separate them out and say, well, this part is the reason and this part is the emotion, you're sort of setting yourself up for some failure.
Uh-huh. And does law privilege and admit reason instead of emotion, or this shift you were just telling us also applies to the law field?
Yeah, again, a terrific question. So historically, again, law has said that we are all about reason, and the point of law in some ways is to try to keep emotion out of things. But we don't really mean it. That's sort of like a party line that we tell ourselves, but we don't actually mean it because the world doesn't function that way. And so sometimes even under those terms, law has recognized that emotion matters. For example, if you're trying to figure out in a criminal case, if somebody says they had a self-defense claim, we'll say, well, were they scared? How scared were they? Was it reasonable for them to be scared? Would an ordinary person in that situation have been scared? Or if we're granting people money damages for their injuries, we might say, well, how much has this impaired their quality of life, their enjoyment of things? What does it mean to enjoy something? What's the money value of enjoyment, right? So I could go on, but pretty much any area of law you look at, it has an emotional component. It just pretends it doesn't. And so the work of the law and emotions movement in the last several decades has been to try to show all the emotional moments that law already explicitly has packed into it and help bring some psychological research to bear on that so that we're doing it better, but also to show all the ways in which law implicates emotion that we don't admit or that we don't see. So it's helping us do the things we purport to be doing better. And it's also to help us see the way that law is implicating emotions in ways that perhaps we don't recognize but should.
Perfect. Well, before talking more specifically about law, we should understand better the role that emotion plays in our daily life. Many psychologists dedicate their lives for this field of research. They say that emotion is not necessarily a pernicious influence. Having in mind what you just said, how emotions reveal and enable reasons.
Yes. So you're quite right that there's a very vibrant area of scientific, and I should say also sociological and philosophical work on emotions and the impact they have on our daily lives. And it's one of the most exciting areas of research right now. And I urge people to check out, for example, the work being done through the Society for Affective Science, for example. But to get back to your question, you've asked how does emotion enable reason and how does emotion reflect reason? Perfect. I'll take them in reverse order. The how does emotion reflect reason goes back to my example about anger, that literally every single emotional experience either of us or any other human being has ever had is underlain by some kind of thought process. I'm sad because I believe that I have suffered the loss of something I care about. I'm happy because I feel validated by the universe or an opportunity has come that I hoped for. And so it's literally nonsensical to pry the reason out of emotion. Now, you could still have irrational emotions because your reasons are bad, right? You could say, well, I am afraid of this person because this person, say, has darker skin than I do. It's irrational not because it has a reason, but because it's a bad reason, right? So it is absolutely true that emotions can be irrational, but they're only as irrational as the thoughts underneath them. Now, the second question you've asked is about how does emotion enable reason? That's a sort of more nuanced kind of proposition. And a lot of this work comes from in psychology and in moral philosophy. So the psychology part comes from a series of primarily brain-based studies where, for example, if you look at patients who have had very strange sorts of brain injuries or diseases that significantly impair their emotional functioning, for example, frontal lobe damage, it turns out that not only are they extremely emotionally dysregulated, but they can't make good decisions because part of what emotions do is they reflect to us what matters. And if you lose that barometer of what matters, you can't actually appropriately value the inputs into ordinary decisions, right? So you end up with people who are perfectly intelligent, but they can't measure their own welfare against, for example, an immediate reward. And so they make disastrous decisions, and they can explain to you why they're wrong decisions, but they can't do anything differently in their everyday lives. From the moral philosophy perspective, they put sort of a different gloss on that same big idea, which is without our emotions, we can't tell what to value. So the idea that our moral outrage, for example, tells us something important about what we think the world should be like, or how wrong we think a particular thing is. Compassion or empathy are ways of our emotions reveal to us the caring that we have for other people and their plights, right? And so from a moral philosophical perspective, true reasons that have to do with leading a good or productive or healthy life, caring about things in the right way, sort of as Aristotle would say, right? Having the right set of emotions for the right reasons and reflecting the right values. If we didn't have our emotions, we wouldn't have any of that.
Yeah, and you mentioned people who had problems on their frontal lobe, and because of that, lost the parameters of what matters. Accepting cases like this one and taking ordinary people into analysis. Is it possible to educate emotions so that people may use their emotions in a conscious way to better guide their own actions?
Absolutely, absolutely. So there's a pop psychology term that's actually a very useful construct. Sometimes pop psychology ideas are silly or trendy, but some of them are not. And one of them is the concept of emotional intelligence. And there's actually a lot of great science on emotional intelligence. And it's the idea that, certainly we can measure people's sort of raw cognitive power as if we were sort of calculation machines. And that tells you something about a person. But something that also tells you something about a person is how good are they at reading their own emotions, reading the emotions of others, anticipating the emotional needs of others, understanding their own emotions, and using their emotions in a pro-social way. And that's actually a fairly high order set of skills. And some people are naturally quite good at them and some people are not, but everyone can get better. So this is a lot of the work that I do with judges, for example, is just teaching basic techniques to do a better job of noticing your emotions, naming your emotions, actually putting a label on it and say, oh, right now I'm angry, and then understanding your emotions. Why am I angry? And if you can do those three things, notice, name, and understand, you're already like 90% down the road.
Wow, just like when one is raising a child?
Yes, I mean, these are very important things that we try in the emotional development of children to teach them. Like if a child is screaming, you really want to help them notice that they're screaming, to be able to name the reason why, and then, to name what it is they're experiencing, and then articulate the reason why. And then you've got something to work with, because you can say, well, I'm mad because such and such happened and I lost my toy. And then you can start to unpack the reasons behind that. And, maybe the emotion is spot on. Yes, it is very sad that your toy just got destroyed. And let's talk about that and what it means to lose things and why that's hard. Or it could be that you're wrong. Maybe the toy's not lost. Maybe they didn't really like the toy, right? But if you don't notice, name, and understand, you've got nothing. You've got nothing to work with. So I think this is not a thing. Well, I know this is not a thing just for children. This is something all of us have to do every day of our lives, usually more than once, right? And and everybody has to do it. Otherwise, the feeling that some people have with their emotions, that emotions just happen to you and all you can do is kind of react to them. That's not true, actually. We have a whole lot of control over the conditions under which we feel things, what we feel, how we express it. We don't have infinite control, obviously. Some things are just terrifying or cause us grief. So it's not about eliminating the emotion. It's really about trying to understand your emotions and being able to work with them. Again, not even necessarily to just tamp them down. Sometimes they're very positive. Like anger can be a tremendous force for change. If you see something that's wrong and it makes you angry, then you have energy, because that's what anger does. If you are very sad about something and it surprises you, again, it kind of shows you what matters to you, and then you say, I should do something for that. I see suffering, I would like to alleviate it, right? So it's never about recognizing the emotions so you can get rid of them. It's always about recognizing and understanding the emotions so you can work with them in the most productive way possible.
Oh, that's interesting that even what we may think is a bad emotion may guide our actions. And
again, it's like there is no bad emotion. There's only emotions sort of in the wrong place at the wrong time or for a bad reason. Like an emotion can be out of whack with the demands of your circumstances. And then you need to see it, understand it, and so you can change some things around so you're not out of whack. Or again, if you have a very bad reason, like you're very jealous of somebody and you really say, okay, I'm jealous. Why am I jealous? I'm jealous because she has such and such and I don't. You can think, well, that's very shallow, isn't it? It's very bad values. Why do I get to have everything, right? And then you can sort of at least give yourself something to work with. So, yeah.
Wow. Yeah. If people had this kind of thought, we would definitely be in a greater society, right?
Yeah. It takes time. It's energy you have to expend. And one thing that I think is important to recognize is that we're all expending energy dealing with our emotions anyway. So we might as well do it deliberately, even if it feels like a greater investment of time and energy. And at the end of the day, it's not. It's just a more targeted, intelligent way of expending that energy.
Perfect. And bringing this emotion theory to the actual context, the emergence of a new coronavirus in China in December of 2019 led to a local epidemic that rapidly spread to multiple countries in the world, placing remarkable challenges in surveillance and in control. Johns Hopkins University says that there are almost 3 million people infected with the virus in more than 180 different countries, and all that in approximately 4 months. In order to stop the COVID-19 spread, countries are taking extraordinary measures to keep its activities. In Brazil, for instance, the Senate met by video conference for the very first time in its 196 years of history to recognize the public calamity situation in which we currently are. The Brazilian Supreme Court replaced its physical plenary sessions for online ones where judges judge from their own homes. And even some Brazilian governors are defending that people who break social isolation get arrested and have to pay for it. Well, all those measures bring some fear to the population, and it's normal that it does. And how do emotions like fear prompt us to respond to the world around us? And is it like with anger that you just mentioned, anger that triggers us to change something? And are emotions such as fear a bad influence for us?
I mean, this is something that's unfolding all around us. So time will tell in some ways, but at the most abstract level, if you think, what does fear do? What is fear for? You're exactly right that it's the same set of questions as with anger. What is fear about? What is fear? What's the thought process, and what kinds of actions does fear predispose us to? So in general, fear again is a felt sensation that we get at the bodily level and at the subjective level that we or somebody that we care about is in danger. And what it tends to make us do is the very familiar flight, freeze, or flight, right? And it's a little unpredictable, actually, which one it's going to be in any given moment. So we might fight, we might freeze, we might flee, or we might do all of those. And they may be all in a jumble, like we might freeze when we should flee, and we might flee when we should fight. And it's actually quite unpredictable which one we're going to do. So so one lesson to learn from that is different people will fear different things. Different people will have different action tendencies from the things they fear. And it's not all going to be the same at all times. So, for example, some people may acutely fear for their own physical health and safety, and that would tend to lead to a withdrawal, which fortunately social isolation gives a socially acceptable space within which to withdraw, right? So some people will withdraw. Some people will want to fight in some way, will want to kind of flail against it, and social isolation is actually a very bad match with that particular action tendency. So I think even if you think at this highly abstracted level, you can understand why some people are acting in ways that the rest of us can't understand. Like, I can't understand how it is that you're in your apartment for 5 weeks without leaving, or I can't understand how in the world you're out at a protest, you know, at this dire moment, right? It's people are having wildly different reactions to what they fear. And again, people are fearing different things. Some people it may be very salient to them that they have no income, for example, but nobody around them has COVID-19. And so the thing that they're afraid of is being threatened by what the epidemiology tells us we have to do. Those people are in a wildly different space emotionally than the people who are most afraid of getting sick. And that's what they see. And therefore, social isolation is going to kind of work for them, right? So I think, you know, one thing that we might want to do is cultivate a little bit of empathy for the fact that people are afraid of different things. Most people are not crazy, even if they're afraid of something different from what you're afraid of. And there's a range of acceptable reactions. The very hard thing, though, and this is, again, where law and emotion can understand each other better, but they can't always be on the exact same page. From a legal perspective, in a crisis situation, you don't always get to tolerate emotional diversity, right? Somebody's viewpoint is going to fit better with the legal response than someone else's. And in this instance, what we are being forced to do in terms of social distancing will work very well with some people's fears and very poorly with others. The fact that people have diverse emotional reactions indeed doesn't mean the law is going to equally recognize them all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think you brought the perfect point that we miss empathy. Right?
Yeah. And I think empathy goes a long way, even if leaders could say things like, I know this is harder for some people than others. I know, for example, if you are not seeing COVID-19 around you, but you are seeing all your plants shut down and you're seeing your jobs disappear, that this may seem unfair to you. And I am sorry for that, and I understand that. However, here's why we're doing it. And if you could have some empathy for the people who will die 2 states away, even though you've never met them. If you go back to work right now, for example, some quantum of people over there who also have families and loved ones will die because of that. And I am sorry that you have to bear that, right? So again, I think even if as public officials and lawmakers, we all got in the habit of extending empathy, even when we're saying, however, this is what we're going to do. I think that would go a long way. Of course, not everyone's going to listen to it. We live in a very toxic media environment where everything gets twisted, but it would still be better, at least, to be able to try to encourage people to feel empathy who are in a different situation, and let everyone know that all the people are, we care about all of your experiences, but here's why we have to do it this way.
Perfect. And in this 20-minute talk, everyone understood why you are so requested, with people calling you all over the United States to speak to public authorities, to judges. And
you're very kind.
No, you deserve much more. But anyway, knowing that you are constantly required to go to conferences where you speak to judges, especially about the balance between rationality and emotion, And considering what you mentioned in one of your papers, that there is not such a thing as dispassionate judges, that dispassionate judges are mythical beings like Santa Claus or Easter Bunny.
The Santa Claus or Easter Bunny's quote is a quote from a judicial opinion. I didn't say that, but I don't disagree with it either.
Perfect. Thank you for rectifying that. But anyway, in one of your texts, you bring this quote, meaning that judges have emotions and that emotions influence decision making. So, in a brief comment, how should judges deal with emotions?
So this is essentially my life's work in 30 seconds, but I will certainly do my best. So in a way, I've said it already. I think that it's very important to recognize that judges, just like all human beings, have emotions in connection with virtually everything that they do, including their work. And my project is to try to surface that. I have a large interview-based qualitative study going right now in the United States where I sit and I talk for several hours, with judges about the emotional content of their work. And it ranges from everything of, coping with feelings of isolation or to facts of cases that make them sad or angry, or the frustration when the law locks them into doing something that they actually would prefer not to do. Conflicts with colleagues. I mean, judges bring their whole human selves to what they do, and part of that is emotion. So again, what are judges meant to do with that? Brings me back really to the beginning of what I said, which is to not pretend that emotion and judicial reason are separable and that you should try to separate. That is a very destructive set of priors to walk into that very difficult task with. If you instead, as a judge, can notice, name, and understand your emotional engagement with your work, then you can start to pick out your reasons. Like, yes, this is a very upsetting set of facts, and who would I be if I weren't saddened by that? I don't want to be that person. I want to be the kind of person who sees the things in the world that are worth grieving over and still have the capacity to grieve. I don't want to crust over. I don't want to become burned out. And yet, once I've acknowledged that, then I can kind of say, okay, what is it that I am required to do in this situation and why? And does my grief or sorrow have anything to do with it? Sometimes it will, actually, because sometimes you're being called upon to make a judgment that requires you to determine how reasonable was it for this person to be this upset, or how much was this person harmed? Those require the judge actually to call on his or her emotions. And sometimes it won't. You'll say, the law is fairly clear here, and it says do this, 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 and that. And my sorrow is normal and it's human, but it doesn't really influence anything on this side of the ledger. So I'm just going to have my sorrow and I'm going to do my job. And that's that. So, but again, I think if judges don't have the permission to recognize the emotional aspects of their work, if they don't have the tools to notice, name, and understand, then they can't do any of that analytical separation. Like, here's where the emotion is relevant, here's where it's not. Here's where it's helpful, here's where it's not. And that's what I think judges have to do with their emotions.
Uh-huh. Yes, and bringing this perspective again to the coronavirus outbreak situation, judges are being requested to deal with several coronavirus-related issues. Some local governments here in Brazil, for example, are requesting private hospitals to allow the use of its ICUs for the public health system and having their private medical doctors at state service. But even before the pandemic situation, some judges were given orders to oblige people with suspected coronavirus disease to test themselves and to self-isolate. How should the judiciary brand act in situations like these ones, in which everyone is afraid, and how should judges let their emotions work in order to give the best decision for the society as a whole?
Yes, I think this really operates on two levels. One is that courts are being called upon to figure out very fundamental ideas about how their own courts work during a time like this. And that is a very emotional task because it's disruptive. Very few people like to have their entire workplace disrupted, and try to radically rethink, the ways that you run your everyday work life, right? So that's just kind of upsetting. And, judges are first responders, and so they really have no choice. So I think of that as one set of challenges. And then again, and in that set of challenges, I think, again, empathy, compassion, and noticing, naming, and understanding are pretty fundamental. So having empathy for court users and knowing, for example, that people still have claims, they still have statutes of limitations that are running, they still have constitutional rights, they still have damages that have been done, they still have injunctions that need to be granted, right? So being able to have empathy for the legitimate needs of court users while also having sort of the courage to be able to say, I know this is important to you, but it's not systemically as important right now as some other things, right? So having empathy and yet also having courage to make tough decisions about certain things that are going to be put off, even though that's going to cause pain for some people. I think having self-care in the sense of not putting yourself and your court staff in harm's way needlessly, right? So not being appropriately afraid yourselves, so that you are, taking the time to actually put some distancing mechanisms into how your court is running. So I could go on about that, but the big idea is that I think the first thing all of us have to do is take care of your own house. And for judges, it's a big house. It's the courts, and other people have rights to say about how things go in the house. So I think, again, empathy, compassion, and courage. In terms of actually adjudicating claims or dealing with the types of legal conflicts that COVID-19 is itself producing, I think of that in a different category, but it requires, I think, the exact same emotional tools. So one of the biggest issues right now in various U.S. courts is the issue of should people who are in detention, particularly some kind of pretrial detention or immigration detention, be let out pending the determination of their proceedings, given that their danger en masse to the rest of society is almost certainly less than the danger that the virus is presenting to them while they are in detention. And this is a particularly strong argument for people who have not actually been adjudicated, say, on any crimes yet, or who have not been proven to be removable from the U.S. yet. And then we also have people who are petitioning for release from post-conviction confinement on the idea that, again, they are less dangerous to the rest of us than the virus is to them in there, right? And those are very, very emotionally charged scenarios for a judge to be in, because it's not just like fear versus rationality. It's like two very legitimate fears of wildly different things, right? Public safety includes, both the harm that people might do to other people if they're released, or the harm they might do to the system if they abscond. But public safety also includes every single person who is in confinement in the United States right now, and their right to not be exposed needlessly to a virus that could kill them. So I have very little in terms of advice on how judges should resolve all those claims, but I just think it's important to notice that there's emotion on all sides there, and it's very hard. Again, if you're afraid of one legitimate thing and you're simultaneously afraid of a second legitimate thing, which one do you prioritize? Mm-hmm. I don't have an answer for that, but I definitely do know that the better job in the more space that judges are given to recognize that is, in fact, what's at the bottom of it all, the more faith I have in their decision making.
Nice. And given the context of this COVID-19 outbreak and other global threats, how do you think that episodes like these ones may influence or may not influence the law and emotion field?
I'm really looking forward to finding out. I know that already. I know that studies are happening because they're coming across my email already. People asking for, please answer this survey, about this aspect of your emotional responses to COVID-19. So I think we're going to be studying this for a long time, but there's a lot of layers to it. There's this idea of collective trauma. I think we're all going through a collective trauma. I think there's sort of direct ways that the law might change, like the law might change, for example, on precedent of when an executive uses, say, the War Powers Act to command private companies to generate needed medical supplies. So we might see legal changes in population-based testing, involuntary testing, right? Like this is the first time, certainly in my lifetime, that there has been a plausible claim that every person within U.S. borders should be required, for example, to take a particular diagnostic test for something. So those things could be direct results, and then I think there will be a lot of indirect results that also have to do with emotion. Like a lot of what is certainly in the U.S. context people are talking about now is how the crisis, the severity and the universality of this crisis has illuminated a lot of cracks in the system, that many people have been complaining about for many years, but suddenly you just see all of them, and it's very upsetting because, if you say this is crazy that, we had to have a law that said, that you can't be charged for getting, a coronavirus test. Well, a lot of people will say, well, what's special about coronavirus except that it's a present crisis? Why should anybody get charged for having to take any test for any deadly disease, right? And suddenly things that we've kind of gotten accustomed to and we just kind of live with, like, oh yeah, people have to pay for their medical care, even for these, crucial diagnostic tests of things that could kill us. And some people don't have money, and so they don't get diagnostics and they die, right? We've become kind of accustomed, unfortunately, to that's just how our society works. And I think moments like this, people will be like, that's terrible, so, and there's this kind of moral, like, well, why isn't that true of, say, cancer? Why should anyone have to pay for cancer treatment if you don't have to pay for coronavirus treatment? Cancer's an epidemic, So I think those kind of unfairness or injustice feelings, that kind of moral compass type of feeling, I think will have a lot of indirect effects on our legal regime that I think will unfold over a very long period of time, and I don't know what they're going to be yet, but I'll definitely be paying attention.
Yeah, great. Let's follow up these things. Professor, I'm now coming definitely to an end. I'm pretty sure that most of the viewers of this video are now interested in the law and emotion field. So if you had to suggest an article or a book for someone who have not already begun to study this area of the law, which book or which article would you suggest, knowing that you have several great articles about this topic?
Absolutely. So I'm going to recommend two things because they're wildly different. And the first is actually the very first article I wrote on this topic, which, as you said, is quite old now, 2006. But it still holds up well, I think, if you're looking to get a sense of the broad sweep of what is law and emotion and what are the questions it asks and how does it go about trying to ask them. So that article is called Law and Emotion, a Proposed Taxonomy of an Emerging Field, and it is in the Journal of Law and Human Behavior. You can also find a direct link to it in my SSRN page or on my vanderbilt.edu website. And the second, if people are interested more specifically in the judging aspect, I would recommend Emotional Regulation and Judicial Behavior from 2011 in the California Law Review, which also I think is holding up fairly well over time. If you go to my Vanderbilt Law School faculty webpage, again, you will see much more. And if you go to my SSRN page, you'll see more there as well.
Okay, thank you. I'll make those links available for those who are interested in accessing them. Professor Terry Maroney, thank you so much for your time and for this illuminating talk. I hope you and yours stay healthy during this challenging time.
Thank you. You too. Please stay safe and please stay relatively sane under the circumstances.
I will. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
E a você que acompanhou a gente nesse encontro, muito obrigado e até a próxima.